I read The Sixth of Dusk by Brandon Sanderson for the Summer of Cosmere, where I'm reading all of the Cosmere stories in the order that they were published. And so you might get spoilers for Elantris, the original Mistborn trilogy, Warbreaker, The Way of Kings, Words of Radiance, and some other short stories set in the Cosmere so far. So, Sixth of Dusk is a story about a guy named Sixth of Dusk, who is what in the story is called a trapper, and he lives on an island in a kind of priestly or like monk life aesthetic lifestyle where he's kind of like by himself all the time, and his only companions are these magical birds called aviar who are with him. And I guess maybe more than priest or monk, maybe shaman would be the right word there, that he has this special relationship with these animals. But he doesn't seem to serve a particular community or anything for spiritual guidance. He is just dedicated in a very special way to the island itself, which he calls the Father. And it's almost as if the island has some kind of godlike presence in his spiritual life. And the story is about him finding out that the island has been invaded by the mainland culture, who are becoming more and more technologically advanced, and that the mainland culture has come into contact with aliens in spaceships, and that they are trying to advance their technology really rapidly to catch up with the alien culture, and that they think that the magical birds that come from this island could be a way to achieve that. And so they're interested in getting on a kind of foothold on this very dangerous island in order to trap some birds. And Six of Dusk, basically, he makes a friend with one of these invaders. He comes to respect her, and it turns out that she's a leader of the group, and he feels that whatever the device is that they're going to use is going to cause some kind of catastrophe to befall the island because of the warnings that he's getting from his magical birds, one of which can see into the future and just shows that like some kind of disaster is coming that is linked with this alien technology that they've suddenly gotten access to. And in the course of the story, Vathi, the woman who travels with Six of Dusk, comes to realize that the ship itself is a kind of trap that is going to bring their entire world under the influence of the aliens if they try to interpret their technology and progress faster than is natural for them. If they kind of like don't earn their way into being a spacefaring civilization. And she realizes this because of the way that Sixth of Dusk has been teaching her throughout the story about the dangers on the island of the Father, and how you can't, there are no gifts. Like everything has a price, and you have to earn everything in this world in order to survive. And that like there's an important lesson there for Vathi to internalize that's going to make her a better leader and make wiser choices around forming a relationship with these alien invaders. And at the end of the story, Six of Dusk agrees to leave the island and to join with Vathi in trying to convince the mainlanders that this relationship with the alien invaders is going to not be to the advantage of their world, that they're putting themselves in a really dangerous position. And so that's kind of a basic sum up of the story. And what I really love about this story is the way that it troubles the ideas that I've been harping on through this Cosmere project, and where I keep talking about like this kind of empathy and like radical inclusion into community that is the good thing, which lifts up fragile, vulnerable individuals and allows them to transcend their weaknesses and evolve into people who can become better because they've joined with a community. So you see it, in Elantris with Raoden, the way that Kelsier led his crew in Mistborn, made all of the crew into better people. The way Vivenna, helped out Vasher, and the way that Vasher helped out Vivenna in Warbreaker. And in the Stormlight Archive, the way that Bridge 4 lifted up Kaladin, just as he, kind of built that community, they helped to rebuild him. And so this, across the Cosmere, we've seen that like forming community is like always a good thing. This is the path to goodness. And if we're talking about these hard limits of good and evil, this, it seems to be like one of the keystones to getting on the right path in the Cosmere. But in this story, forming community has this very dangerous edge to it, that there's something about solidarity, rugged individualism that's highly prized in this story, and that is a virtue in a way that it doesn't feel like in other stories within the Cosmere that is true. And a big theme in the story has to do with symbiotic or parasitic relationships. So Sixth of Dusk has these magical AVR birds who, we've learned about investiture and the kind of magical energies and the way that they are the power source to all different kinds of magical systems on different worlds that are like radically different from each other, but it feels like they share some kind of fundamental materialist kind of like alternate physics, right? And so these birds somehow have magical investiture, and then they have a telepathic link to their trapper who, takes care of them in order to give him various powers. And one of the birds is not native to these islands, and therefore it seems like the different breeds of birds have different powers associated with them. So it's not like down to individuals. It's almost like, on the Mistborn world, where you have the different metals have different specific powers, right? It's the same idea with these birds, even though they all seem to be like some kind of variation of tropical birds like parrots or whatever. They're different kinds of parrots. And so each one of the different kinds has different powers. And he has taken one from the mainland and has successfully gotten it to, be invested with power and to reveal a new ability, which is glimpsing into the future and seeing the ways that he might die. And this kind of gives him a warning to watch out for all of the dangers on the island. It reminds me of Atium from Mistborn again. How that would let you see briefly into the future. And so when you're fighting in hand-to-hand combat, it basically makes you invincible. There's something like that where he's walking through the jungle and it's filled with, poisonous ants and carnivorous plants and all of these crazy, like big monsters that will eat you. And he's able to successfully navigate his way through the jungle because he gets all of these warnings from his AVR about the dangers ahead. And what we find out is that the way these birds get their invested power is once again from a pool of water. And so we've seen that pool of water motif repeated again and again through the Cosmere in Elantris and Mistborn, in the Stormlight Archive and Warbreaker. So it's all over the place. Here's another pool of water. There's a special plant that grows out of it that has a fruit, and when the AVR eat the fruit, there are worms inside which invade their body and they get, parasitic worms. And these worms are the thing that have the investiture in them and then they form some kind of like symbiosis with the bird, who then has a mental link to the trapper. And that is kind of like the circle of investiture there between the practitioner and these birds, who are the ones who are in actual contact with the magical energy. So it feels a little bit like Kaladin and Syl, or Shallan and Pattern, how they have, their magical companion with them who advises them. This trapper, Sixth of Dusk, has the Aviar who helps him. And so there's like a way that he has a kind of community with these natural animals, but they're not the same as being around people. And there's a way in which he's kind of instrumentalizing the animals, even though he like clearly cares about them, he does keep them around for their utility. And so there's something kind of parasitic in that relationship, which I think is kind of, being dramatized or drawn out by the actual parasitic nature of the worms inside of the birds. There's an echo of that in the way that Dusk takes care of the birds, in order to use them. And it's for sure the way that the mainlanders want to interact with the Aviar. They want to turn them into a commercial product, to sell them to mainlanders, rich mainlanders. That's one of the things they're going to do with the Aviar. And they're going to exploit them and probably sell them to the aliens. And so that's exploitative. That's kind of a parasitic thing. But these mainlander companies want to use the trappers in that same way to like round up the Aviar and to help settle the island in a way to make it far less dangerous and easier to capitalize on. And so there's a theme of assimilation here, which is kind of the dark side of the community theme, I think. That like when you form a community, it's not always a good thing that helps lift people up in order to transcend their weaknesses and reframe their idea of who they are, and on like that, like I keep saying in all of these podcasts. This is pointing out a kind of darkness to forming community, because there's a way in which the aliens are trying to trap the people on this world by giving them technology and giving them a manual in order to understand the inner workings of the broken ship. The whole thing is like a honeypot to somehow work around their rules of not interacting with societies that haven't developed space travel yet. They're trying to like give them a boost of technological advancement so that they can exploit these people and exploit the resources of their world. And so that kind of community is extremely unhealthy. It's very harmful and traumatic, and it's not going to lift anybody up. In fact, it's going to actively keep people down. And so, again, I just feel like Sanderson is kind of like troubling this idea that up to this point in the Cosmere has seemed purely good. And this is like coming right on the heels of the, Allomancer Jack kind of satirical story. But there was that kind of inscribed layer to the pulp hero that had to do with colonialism and racial supremacy and all of that kind of stuff, which was satirized in the story, but still present. And I think what we're seeing here is a more serious portrayal of the same ideas, but given a little bit more of a kind of horror twist. Because the island, the father, or Patji, which I think is the way that you say it in their language, is a really scary place. It's not like a thrilling adventure. It feels like very oppressive. And it's not clear, that these characters are going to survive when they're going through. And the specialized knowledge that Dusk has about the father has come, through a very high price of losing his mentor, who was his uncle, and, living this solitary lifestyle and devoting all of his energy to learning the various ways that this island is constantly trying to destroy him. And I think in this story, that kind of difficulty, that survival that he does manage to eke out on the island is presented to us as a virtue in and of itself, not unlike what was happening in the Mistborn trilogy, where survival is, actually like lifted up to the point where it becomes a religion that persists 300 years later, once the world no longer has to merely survive, but can start to flourish. But I think Dusk sees virtue in difficulty and struggle in itself, like for its own sake, that also echoes with the themes that we're seeing in the Stormlight Archive, that, there's that journey before destination. There's that way that the struggle produces something good for Dusk all on its own that has nothing to do necessarily with outcomes. That in struggling, it cultivates in the trapper a type of hypervigilance, which is not merely useful for survival, but is a way of seeing the world that helps you to discern the truth about potential relationships. This goes right back to Silence, Shadows for Silence in the Forests of Hell short story, where Silence has hypervigilance all the time because of the trauma that she experienced in her extremely hostile environment, but that gave her this heightened capability to go out into the dangerous forests and not only survive, but thrive and build a reputation and a business. And she has this similar feeling in the story that Dusk does, where Dusk both loves the island, the father, and hates the father at the same time. And she felt that way about her grandmother, the White Fox, that she loved her for giving her this capacity, this capability, but hated her for traumatizing her with the, kind of hypervigilance that never goes away. And so Dusk loves the island so much and values the relationship that he has with it, but resents the way that it is constantly trying to destroy him. And that it seems to be completely ungrateful about, his efforts to keep the secrets of the island from the mainlanders so that they, don't come in and change everything. But that's kind of something that I think that Dusk is projecting onto the island, that, maybe the island does have intentions when we look at, the ways that, say, Shallan interacted with the ship that she was on in Words of Radiance at the beginning of the story. She soul casts the ship and she has a conversation with it, and the ship has intentions and memories. So who knows? Maybe the island is alive in some essential sense and does have intentions, but is Dusk actually discerning those, or is he projecting onto them his own reluctance and his own kind of almost nostalgia for a different time in history when things were protected better and segregated better, to where the trappers would be on the islands and the mainlanders were too scared to come out and see these things? Because I think change is another really big theme in this story, where, the name Dusk itself is that point between daytime and nighttime. It is a period of change. And so it's almost as if Sixth of Dusk himself is presiding over the change in the historical moment that he occupies, where he began things as a singular trapper on this island where only the kind of holy men, shamans, dared to walk and build houses. And now there is a kind of fortress being built by the mainlanders, and it's inevitable that the island will be tamed and cultivated for its resources. And so that's like, he's presiding over that period of change. And the question is, will it be cultivated for the use of the people on the planet, or will it be cultivated for a kind of parasitic use of the aliens? So in other words, like, it feels like the question, which is left hung up in the air a little bit at the end of the story, is will the people of this world kind of turn into trappers at large who have this relationship with the father and reap the benefits of the investiture and the relationships with the AVRs? Or will they themselves kind of become the AVRs to the aliens? Will they be like the little pets who are exploited by these starfaring invaders? And neither one of those sits comfortably with that larger theme of community, which is something that I really appreciate about the way that this pushes around the themes and the edges of what has been established by Sanderson in the Cosmere. And so even though the story is pretty short, I think it's doing a lot of work of grappling with those much bigger themes of community in the Cosmere and what are the costs of that in a way that we really haven't seen since the story of Silence in the Forests of Hell, where this kind of independent spirit, this being on your own, has its own virtue. It has its own place in the Cosmere. And that the real goodness at the bedrock of it comes back to that kind of thing that I was talking about in Words of Radiance, that has to do with an alignment internally of integrity, that Sixth of Dusk is pulling his culture back to something truer, like being true to themselves, rather than moving their culture into a place that is more comfortable for the aliens. And so, like they're literally aliens, right? Like they're literally pulling the world into a different state of being, and Dusk is pulling it back to what it more fundamentally is in a truer sense. And so that is, the touchstone again of where goodness lies in the Cosmere. That's why Shallan and Kaladin can both be heroes, even though the way that they interact with the truth and, like the way that they present their personal integrity in the world is completely opposite from each other. It's because of the way that they are both getting in touch with something truer inside themselves. And I think that that's what's happening here with Sixth of Dusk as well, that he's really like pushing Vathi to see the world in the way that he does, so that she can recognize that they're going to enter into this parasitic relationship. He's kind of bringing her back to herself, that it's not her place to push the culture to meet the technology of the aliens. Instead, it is their place to be themselves, right? They don't need to try and be a different kind of people in order to get access to all of the things that these aliens have to offer. They have their own things to offer. That's why the aliens are there, because they're interested in things that they can't provide for themselves. And so Vathi needs to kind of like realign or reframe the way that she is seeing herself and her own people, that they have intrinsic value, that they have their own path to walk, and that they need to earn every step along the way. And the whole thing about aliens is like really fascinating, right? I remember the first time that I read this and I was shocked that there were aliens and like really confused. I was like, what do you mean there are aliens? Are they like tentacle monsters? Like, what are we talking about? And they seem to be people. We don't really see the aliens, not that I can remember. They're just talked about in a general way. And what I realized was, oh, this is like spacefaring technology that is still fundamentally, based in the magic systems that Sanderson has presented to us throughout the story so far. And so what this hints at is that in the future of the Cosmere stories, we're going to have like magical people in space. That we're going to get something, in the kind of tone or register or tradition of Flash Gordon, Star Wars, Voltron, that kind of thing, where there's like magical powers, laser beams, wizards in space, and that kind of stuff. And so we're getting this kind of classic sci-fi first contact story, but there's all of this magic that is still a part of the story and is actually like the motivating factor for the aliens coming here at all, I think, is because of the magical aviar birds. They want this magic from them. And so the magic and the sci-fi element of aliens is not at odds with each other. They're interacting in a very specific way that is speaking to this relationship of exploitation, that even though they have this very advanced technology, they can't do this specific kind of magic. And so the magic almost operates as a kind of materialist commodity that gains value due to its rarity, vis-a-vis the aliens. They can't do this kind of thing, therefore they want it. And Sanderson's entire Cosmere project has been pretty materialist this whole time, right? Like the magic systems feel almost scientific. We talk about, particular vibrations in the Mistborn trilogy that Vin can sense the different kind of rhythms almost that have to do with like, oh, that's tin and that's steel, that she can feel when, the Allomancers are burning their different metals. And that whole thing that I keep going on about where the Elantrians are doing word magic that it very specifically aligns the signified with the signifier. And so there's something like materialistic and no nonsense about that. There's not like, oh, the words mean whatever they mean to you and it's all wishy-washy and relativistic. No, it comes down to a very real relationship with the world itself. And so the magic has always lended itself to this kind of, like science fantasy tone. And this is a hint that in the future, it's going to become even more science fantasy, that we might enter into a time in the Cosmere where it's looking a lot more like Star Wars, where we're having big space battles but then people are confronting each other face to face, just like in Star Wars, and using their magical powers against each other. So that will be like a totally different and new possibility that is introduced in this, tiny little short story, which is a pretty cool move, I think. And so then I'm going to move on to the second book in the second era of Mistborn, going back to Wax and Wane for the next one with The Shadows of Self. And that gets followed up by The Bands of Mourning. And so no more Stormlight Archive yet, but plenty more adventures in the roughs and more, magical cowboys in the big city having adventures. So that's going to be a lot of fun. I'm really looking forward to rereading these books.